My name is Natalie Gonzalez. I am 32 years old, and I learned the exact price of my family's love from a surgical recovery bed in Boise, Idaho. A few hours earlier, my SUV hit black ice on Interstate 84. I woke up with 3 broken ribs, a shattered right wrist, and a baby missing from my arms. My 6-week-old daughter, Lily, had been moved to the pediatric unit for observation. My husband, Mark, was trapped in Seattle by a winter storm with every flight grounded. Someone needed to sit with my newborn. My mother, Diane, lived exactly 20 minutes from the hospital. I called her, begging for help. She said no. She chose a cat instead. And then she delivered one sentence that ended our relationship forever. Your sister doesn't have these emergencies. My sister, Ashley, was on a Caribbean cruise. What I did in the next few minutes ended 9 years of financial abuse, totaling $486,000. And the part that truly broke them walked into my room the next day. It was my grandfather, carrying a worn manila folder. Welcome to Revenge Order, the channel for people who finally stop funding their own abusers. If you have ever been the family mule, drop a comment with your age and tell me the exact moment you stopped caring. And be sure to subscribe. I need to take you back to that hospital room because the silence in it was deafening. The anesthesia was wearing off. The fluorescent tubes above my bed buzzed with a steady hum. Every breath sent a sharp ache through my chest. The heavy plaster cast on my right arm pulled my shoulder down into the mattress. A gray plastic ID band cut into my uninjured left wrist. I reached for my phone on the tray table. Mark had just texted that the airport roads were closed. I dialed my mother. She answered on the 4th ring. Through the speaker, I heard the faint, canned applause of a television game show. "Mom," I said. My voice sounded thin and raspy. I was in a wreck on the interstate. I am out of surgery. Lily is down in the pediatric ward all alone, and Mark cannot get a flight out of Seattle. I need you to drive over and hold her. A long pause hung on the line. I listened to the television clapping in her living room. I waited for the panic, the sound of keys jingling, the rush of a mother grabbing her coat. "Natalie, the roads are terrible right now," Diane sighed. The sound was measured, annoyed. "Plus, I promised Ashley I would go over and feed her Bengals. She paid extra for the drink package on her cruise. If I skip the cats, she will panic and ruin her whole trip. You know how she gets." I stared at the acoustic ceiling tiles. A cat. "I asked you to watch your injured granddaughter." "You will figure it out," she reasoned. "You always figure it out." Then she shifted the phone and dropped the line. "Your sister doesn't have these emergencies." The line clicked dead. I held the phone against my chest. People expect a woman in a hospital bed to break down and sob. I did not shed a single tear. Tears require a level of hope I no longer possessed. I looked down at the gray plastic band digging into my flesh. For my entire life, I had played the reliable daughter. I was the senior risk analyst who balanced the ledgers and absorbed the collateral damage of a broken family. Using my left thumb, I opened a browser. I searched for a premium overnight pediatric care agency in Boise. Within 10 minutes, I had a vetted nurse dispatched directly to Lily's floor. My child was safe. The immediate crisis was handled. With the room quiet again, a frigid clarity settled over me. My mother had chosen a cat over my newborn. Yet for 9 years, I had quietly funded her existence. I opened my banking app. The screen cast a blue glow across the dark sheets. I looked at the scheduled transfers. Tomorrow was the first of the month. Tomorrow, $4,500 was set to leave my account to cover the life of a woman who could not be bothered to drive 20 minutes to see if I was breathing. I needed to look at the numbers. Numbers do not lie, and they do not demand apologies. I scrolled through the transaction history. I had started sending the money when I got my first corporate promotion. It was supposed to be for my father's heart medication and their mortgage. I never missed a payment. I multiplied the monthly transfer by 108 months. The interface stared back at me with the total, $486,000. I had traded $500,000 of my own labor for the illusion of a family. The family I thought I was protecting did not exist. The actual family was sitting in front of a game show, worrying about a cruise ship drink package. My thumb hovered over the cancel button. The plastic band pinched my skin again, a hard, physical reminder of exactly where I was. I tapped the screen. Once. Then again. 4 recurring transfers evaporated into the digital void. Green checkmarks confirmed the action. The financial faucet I had left running for nearly a decade simply stopped. Tomorrow morning, my mother was going to wake up to a very different reality. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile hospital room. Outside the frosted glass, the Idaho winter storm continued to howl, burying the interstate under a blanket of white. I lay flat on my back, the heavy plaster cast anchoring my right arm to the mattress. Every inhalation pulled sharply at my broken ribs. But the physical pain was a distant secondary ache compared to the cold clarity settling into my mind. I stared at the screen of my phone. The blue light washed over my bruised face, illuminating the banking application I had opened. For a long time, I just looked at the main dashboard. I was a senior financial risk analyst. My entire career was built on identifying bad investments, mitigating losses, and spotting liabilities before they bankrupted a company. Yet the greatest financial liability of my life was sitting right there in my personal recurring transfers folder. There were 4 specific automated payments scheduled for the first of every month. The first was labeled Richard Medical, set at $900. The second read Gonzalez Mortgage, a clean $2,000. The third was Household Utilities for $600. The fourth simply said Diane Emergency Fund for $1,000. $4,500 every single month. My thumb hovered over the screen, but my mind pulled me backward, dragging me down into the memory of how the trap was originally set. It is easy for outsiders to wonder how a rational, educated woman could hand over her paycheck for nearly a decade. They do not understand that the grooming starts long before you ever see a bank statement. I was 23 years old. I had just landed my first real corporate job at a downtown firm, but I was still picking up closing shifts at a local coffee shop to pay off my student loans. I remembered walking into my childhood home late one Tuesday evening. My apron smelled like roasted beans and stale milk. The house was dark except for the kitchen, where my mother sat at the worn oak table. Diane had a stack of envelopes spread out in front of her. Final notice bills. Collection letters. She was resting her forehead in her hands, her shoulders shaking, in a quiet, calibrated rhythm. I dropped my backpack and rushed over. I asked her what was wrong. Diane looked up, her eyes red and swimming with tears. She slid a medical bill across the table. It was for my father. Richard had experienced some mild chest palpitations earlier that year. The doctor prescribed a basic beta blocker and suggested a diet change. But Diane treated it like a terminal diagnosis. "I just do not know how we will keep the house natty," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father is too proud to ask for help, but his heart cannot take this stress. The mortgage is behind, the prescriptions are so expensive. I am terrified I am going to wake up and find him gone." I stood in that kitchen, feeling the sheer weight of a daughter's terror. I loved my father. I trusted my mother. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope containing my very first corporate bonus check. I endorsed the back and slid it across the table into her hands. The change in Diane was instantaneous. The tears stopped. She stood up, wrapped her arms around me, and squeezed tight. "You are our savior, Natalie," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "You are the rock of this family. Ashley is too fragile to handle this kind of pressure. You are the only one strong enough to keep us afloat." That was the psychological snare. She handed me an identity, the strong one, the savior, the load-bearing wall. I wore that title like a badge of honor, never realizing it was actually a yoke. When you are praised for carrying a heavy burden, you stop noticing that the people cheering for you are the ones piling the rocks onto your back. A sharp throb in my shattered wrist snapped me back to the present. The hospital room materialized around me, cold and indifferent. I was 32 now. I was a mother. My own baby was lying in a plastic bassinet 2 floors below me, surrounded by strangers, because the woman who called me her savior could not be bothered to pause her evening to comfort her. Ashley was too fragile to help back then, and apparently Ashley was too fragile to have her vacation interrupted now. I looked back at the glowing screen of my phone. The analyst inside me took over, stripping away the residual guilt and replacing it with raw, unfeeling mathematics. I multiplied $4,500 by 12 months, $54,000 a year. I multiplied that by 9 years, $486,000, nearly $500,000 of my own labor. I thought about what that money represented. It was the down payment on the house Mark and I had delayed buying for 3 years. It was the college fund I had not yet started for Lily. It was the countless weekend trips we skipped, the dinners we declined, the quiet financial anxiety we swallowed so my parents could supposedly keep their heat on and buy heart medicine. I had funded a fiction. I had bled my own future dry to water a mirage. I tapped the first transfer, Richard Medical. A prompt appeared on the screen asking if I wanted to cancel this recurring series. I pressed confirm. A green checkmark materialized. I tapped the second, Gonzalez Mortgage. Confirm. Another green checkmark. Household Utilities. Confirm. Diane Emergency Fund. Confirm. With 4 deliberate taps of my left thumb, the list vanished. The screen went blank. The sensation that washed over me was not grief. It was not even anger. It was the distinct, heavy feeling of a thick steel vault door sliding shut and locking into place. The financial umbilical cord was severed. The phantom weight I had carried on my shoulders since I was 23 years old simply evaporated into the sterile hospital air. I locked my phone and set it down on the plastic tray table. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of my heart monitor. My pulse was slow and even. I felt safer in this broken body, isolated in a storm, than I had ever felt sitting at my mother's kitchen table. I glanced at the digital clock on the wall. It was approaching midnight. In a few minutes, the calendar would roll over to the first of the month. Automated clearinghouses across the country would begin processing the day's scheduled transactions. Mortgages would be paid. Utility companies would draft their dues. But my bank account would remain closed. The money was not moving. I pulled the thin hospital blanket up to my chin. My mother had built her entire lifestyle on the assumption that my compliance was a permanent, unbreakable resource. She had pushed me away when I was bleeding, assuming my wallet would stay behind. Tomorrow morning, the sun was going to rise over Boise. The banks were going to open their digital ledgers, and my mother was going to walk up to the cash register of her life only to discover her favorite credit card had just been cut in half. Morning arrived in the trauma ward with the subtle shift of gray light creeping through the frosted window pane. The winter storm outside had finally broken, leaving Boise paralyzed under 2 feet of snow. I lay still, cataloging the damage to my body. The sharp ache in my ribs had settled into a deep, heavy throb. The plaster encasing my right arm felt like a concrete block anchoring me to the bed. A floor nurse walked in to check my vitals and replace my intravenous fluid bag. She offered a quiet, sympathetic smile and delivered the only news that mattered. Lily was doing exceptionally well. My newborn had slept through the night under the watchful eye of the private pediatric nurse I had hired. Her vital signs were perfect, and she was already taking a bottle. A profound sense of relief washed over me, cooling the residual panic that had lingered in my chest since the crash. As the nurse adjusted my oxygen cannula, my phone vibrated on the plastic tray table. It was not a standard ringtone. It was a prolonged, rhythmic buzzing indicating an incoming video call. I turned my head. The screen displayed my sister's name, Ashley. For a brief second, the ingrained habits of my past urged me to decline the call. The old version of me would have felt an overwhelming need to protect my younger sister from bad news. The old Natalie would have crafted a gentle text message, carefully omitting the severity of the accident, so Ashley could enjoy her vacation without guilt. But the old Natalie died on the icy asphalt of Interstate 84. The woman occupying this hospital bed was someone entirely different. I reached over with my uninjured left hand and accepted the FaceTime request. The connection established, and my screen exploded with the blinding, saturated colors of the Caribbean. The visual contrast was jarring. My end of the video feed showed a pale woman in a faded hospital gown, sporting a bruised jaw, a nasal oxygen tube, and a heavy plaster cast, surrounded by clinical gray walls. Ashley's end of the feed was a sun-drenched teak deck. Behind her, the turquoise ocean stretched toward a cloudless horizon. The tinny, cheerful rhythm of a live steel drum band echoed through the speaker, layered over the sound of crashing waves. Ashley held the camera close to her face. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a wide-brimmed straw hat. She did not look at my square on the screen. She was too busy looking at her own reflection in the camera, adjusting the angle to capture her best side. "Nat," she began, her voice dripping with profound irritation, "I am having a literal nightmare of a morning." She did not say hello. She did not ask why I was lying flat on my back in a room that clearly looked like a medical facility. She just launched directly into her grievances. I waited. I let the silence stretch, curious to see how long she could speak without registering the reality on the other end of the line. "I burned the bridge of my nose yesterday because the Cabana boy forgot to bring the premium sunscreen," Ashley complained, tapping her face. "It is peeling. I have a brand launch coming up next month, and I cannot look like a shedding reptile in my promotional photos. So I went down to the resort spa this morning to get the restorative aloe wrap." Ashley was 28 years old. She described herself on social media as an aspiring lifestyle curator. In reality, she was a woman who had never held a traditional job for longer than 6 months. Traditional employment, she often argued, stifled her creative energy. She needed freedom to build her personal brand. That freedom was subsidized entirely by what she called the family account, a communal treasury she genuinely believed our parents managed and funded. She had absolutely no idea that her older sister was the sole architect of that wealth. I walked up to the reception desk. Ashley continued leaning closer to the microphone to project her outrage over the steel drums. I handed them the platinum card, and the receptionist looked at me like I was some kind of street beggar. She said the card declined. Declined, Natalie, in front of a lobby full of people. I have never been so humiliated in my entire life. I listened to her recount this tragedy. A woman whose sister nearly bled to death 12 hours ago was demanding sympathy because a resort employee refused to give her a free facial. The sheer weaponized entitlement of it was breathtaking. I felt the very last drop of sisterly warmth evaporate from my chest, leaving behind a cold, clinical void. I tried to call Mom. Ashley huffed, taking a sip from a brightly colored drink garnished with a pineapple wedge. She did not pick up. So I tried running the backup emergency visa Mom gave me before I left. The receptionist swiped it twice. Declined. That specific detail hit my brain like a physical strike. My analytical mind instantly engaged, sifting through the data she had just unwittingly handed me. I had sent $4,500 to Diane just 4 weeks ago, right on schedule. I had been sending that exact amount for 108 months. Diane lived in a paid-off house. Her basic living expenses were minimal. If Diane had received nearly $500,000 over the last decade, why on earth were her backup credit cards maxed out? A glitch at the bank might explain one decline transaction, but it would not explain a secondary emergency credit line failing. Maxed out cards meant Diane was carrying massive, rotating debt. The money I had been wiring was not sitting in a savings account. It was not acting as a safety net. It was vanishing into a void consumed by something volatile and expensive. "Did the bank glitch?" Ashley demanded, snapping me back to the video call. "You deal with the bank stuff for Mom sometimes, right? You need to call them and fix the family account. I am docking in Cozumel this afternoon, and I have a beach photo shoot scheduled. I cannot function without access to those funds. Fix it before I get off the ship." She stared into the camera, expecting the same response she had received her entire life. She expected her hyper-competent older sister to nod, apologize for the inconvenience, and magically resolve the friction in her fabricated universe. I looked at her sunburned nose. I looked at the tropical drink in her hand. I felt the ache in my shattered wrist and thought about my newborn daughter sleeping in a plastic hospital crib. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice to point out my injuries. I did not mention the terrifying spin on the black ice, the sound of crunching metal, or the fact that our mother had abandoned my baby for a cat. Providing her with those details would imply that I still desired her empathy. I did not want her empathy. I did not want anything from her, ever again. I took a slow, measured breath. "I will look into it," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any recognizable emotion. "Okay, well, hurry up," Ashley sighed, rolling her eyes behind her oversized sunglasses. "I am literally trapped on this boat until you do." I reached out with my left thumb and ended the call. The vibrant colors of the Caribbean vanished, replaced by my home screen. The silence returned to the hospital room, but the atmosphere had shifted. The pieces of a much larger, darker puzzle were beginning to align in my mind. Ashley was currently stranded on a luxury cruise ship with useless plastic in her wallet, furious at a temporary inconvenience. But a far greater storm was brewing back in Idaho. It was mid-morning. The automated clearinghouses had processed the daily transactions. The monthly transfers I had canceled in the middle of the night were officially dead. My mother was about to check her balances. Diane was going to realize the golden goose had just been slaughtered. And she was standing on the edge of a financial cliff with a wallet full of maxed-out credit cards. The digital clock on the hospital wall flipped to 10:30. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a blinding, silent landscape of undisturbed snow. Inside my room, the quiet was suddenly shattered by my phone. It did not ring. It began to vibrate in short, rapid bursts, dancing across the plastic tray table like a trapped insect. I picked it up with my uninjured hand. My notification screen was completely flooded. A dozen alerts were stacked on top of each other, all originating from a specific group text labeled the Gonzalez family. This chat thread was a digital gathering place for nearly 20 relatives. It included my parents, Ashley, several aunts, uncles, and a handful of cousins scattered across the Pacific Northwest. Historically, the chat was reserved for mundane updates, photographs of holiday turkeys, generic birthday wishes, and links to news articles about local weather. It was a superficial space where my mother, Diane, liked to project the image of a close-knit, traditional American family. I unlocked the screen and tapped the notification. Diane had deployed a nuclear strike. Realizing the monthly transfers had failed and her accounts were overdrawn, she did not call me to ask if I was hurt. She did not check on her granddaughter. Instead, she went immediately on the offensive, seizing the public stage to control the narrative before I could even formulate my own thoughts. She had composed a massive, multi-paragraph message weaponizing a level of theatrical victimhood I had never seen in writing before. "I am writing this with a heavy, broken heart," Diane began. Her text was punctuated with crying emojis. "I never thought I would live to see the day my own flesh and blood would turn her back on the people who raised her. Natalie has decided to throw a selfish, unprovoked tantrum. She has completely cut off contact with us and abandoned her struggling parents in our old age out of pure spite." I read the words twice, letting the sheer audacity of the lie wash over me. A woman who had refused to drive 20 minutes to comfort my newborn daughter was currently accusing me of abandonment. "Your father's health is so fragile right now," the message continued. "He is heartbroken. We have given that girl everything. We have supported her career and her choices, even when she pushed us away. Now she is punishing us because we asked her for a tiny bit of grace during a difficult week. I do not know how we will cover Richard's heart medicine this month. We have always managed on our own, but this cruelty is just too much to bear." I stopped scrolling and focused on that specific sentence. We have always managed on our own. That was the core of my mother's mythology. It was the lie she had spent a decade cultivating. Diane loved to play the stoic, independent matriarch who kept her household running through sheer grit and maternal sacrifice. She had spent 9 years cashing my automated deposits on the first of every month, quietly siphoning nearly $500,000 from my labor, while simultaneously telling her brothers and sisters that she and Richard never took a dime from their children. The responses in the group chat were instantaneous and brutal. My mother had successfully rallied her audience. Aunt Susan was the first to reply. Susan was Diane's older sister. In our family dynamic, Susan was the self-righteous enforcer. She was a woman who treated every family interaction like a moral crusade, wielding guilt like a blunt instrument. Susan had not called me in 3 years, except to solicit donations for her church raffle. Susan replied with a string of praying hands and broken heart symbols. "This is disgusting," Susan typed. "Shame on her for kicking a sick man when he is down. Family takes care of family. Diane, let me know if you need anything. We will pray for Natalie's soul." A cousin chimed in with a shocked face emoji. Another aunt posted a lengthy paragraph about how the younger generation has no respect for their elders. Nobody in that chat thread knew the truth because the truth had never been allowed in the room. They were consuming a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Diane had brilliantly preempted any complaints I might make about the car crash or the abandoned baby by framing me as the aggressor. If I spoke up now, if I tried to explain my injuries or the canceled transfers, I would just look like a bitter daughter trying to justify her cruelty toward a sick father. I held the phone, feeling the old, familiar reflex rising in my chest. The desperate, anxious urge to explain myself. The overwhelming need to type out a logical defense, to list the broken bones, to upload a picture of my shattered wrist, to soften the blow and manage everyone's feelings the way I had managed everything else my entire adult life. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could end the smear campaign right now. I could expose the lie. I looked at the gray plastic band on my left wrist. I looked at the heavy plaster on my right arm. I thought about the cold, analytical math I had performed in the middle of the night. Explaining myself was the old Natalie. Defending my actions meant participating in the drama. It meant acknowledging that Diane's accusations deserved a response. The woman who survived the spin on the black ice no longer craved validation from a digital echo chamber of hypocrites. I realized that the absolute worst thing I could do to my mother was nothing. Diane thrived on conflict. She needed a villain to play against. She expected me to engage in a messy, emotional screaming match that would only serve to prove her point to the relatives. I slowly lowered my thumb. I backed out of the group chat. I turned the phone face down on the plastic tray table and leaned my head against the hospital pillow. The silence that followed was incredibly potent. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a fortified bunker. By refusing to reply, I had trapped Diane in her own performance. Her smear campaign was built on the assumption that I would react. When the target refuses to return fire, the attacker is left standing alone on the battlefield, swinging at ghosts. I was letting the lie hang in the air, allowing the relatives to stew in their borrowed outrage, knowing full well that an unaddressed accusation eventually begins to look desperate. The digital mob had been unleashed, but the castle gates remained firmly closed. I closed my eyes and focused on the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. I was safe. Lily was safe. My bank account was locked. The emotional abuse was contained within a small rectangular screen that I had the power to ignore. However, my analytical training warned me that a cornered asset is incredibly dangerous. Diane had just discovered that her primary source of income was gone. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her golden child was stranded on a cruise ship with a declined visa. And her public shaming tactic had just hit a brick wall of absolute silence. The smear campaign had failed to provoke a response. A woman addicted to spending other people's money does not simply give up when her first strategy fails. Diane was standing on the edge of a financial abyss, and she needed cash immediately. If guilt and public humiliation could not force me to open my wallet, I knew Diane would have to escalate. She would have to manufacture an emergency so severe, so catastrophic, that my ingrained sense of duty would override my new boundaries. I just had to wait to see what kind of disaster she was willing to invent. The noon sun reflected off the fresh snow outside my window, casting a stark white glare across the textured ceiling of my hospital room. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the heating vent provided a steady background noise. I had spent the last hour existing in a strange, suspended state of peace. By ignoring the chaotic group chat, I had successfully starved my mother of the attention she so desperately craved. I assumed she would retreat to scheme her next move, perhaps complain to her neighbors, or draft another public grievance to garner sympathy from her peers. I underestimated the sheer terrifying desperation of a person losing their primary revenue stream. My phone vibrated on the plastic tray table. It was a single, sustained buzz, indicating a direct text message, bypassing the muted family thread entirely. I turned my head and glanced at the screen. The sender was Diane. I reached over with my uninjured left hand and opened the message. The text was short, but it carried the weight of a loaded gun. "Your father is in the emergency room with severe chest pains," the message read. "The stress of you cutting us off pushed his heart to the limit. The doctors are evaluating him for a myocardial infarction right now. The billing department needs a $5,000 deposit to admit him to the cardiac wing because our insurance lapsed. Send the money right now, Natalie. If he dies today, his blood is on your hands." A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. The oxygen in the room seemed to evaporate instantly. My breath hitched, catching painfully against my fractured ribs. This was the ultimate trump card. For 9 long years, my deepest, most paralyzing fear had been losing my father. Richard was a quiet, passive man, heavily subdued by his wife's dominating personality, but he was the only parent who ever showed me fleeting moments of genuine warmth during my childhood. The original financial arrangement began specifically because of his supposed cardiovascular health. The idea that my sudden rebellion had triggered a lethal medical event was a nightmare brought to life. My pulse pounded in my temples. The ingrained psychological programming flared up, overriding my newfound boundaries. The obedient, terrified daughter inside me screamed to act. My hand actually trembled as I hovered my thumb over the banking application icon on my home screen. $5,000 was a fraction of my current savings. I could wire the funds in 30 seconds. I could save his life. I could fix the damage I had caused. I unlocked the phone. The familiar banking dashboard loaded, displaying my available balances. Then, the senior risk analyst woke up. In corporate finance, whenever a vendor demands an urgent, unverified wire transfer under the threat of impending catastrophe, it triggers a mandatory fraud protocol. At my firm, we call it the panic principle. Scammers create a false, compressed timeline to force a target into making an unforced error. Urgency is the primary tool of a predator. Panic is designed to bypass logic. I stared at the digital numbers on my screen and forced myself to inhale slowly, counting the seconds in my head to regulate my heart rate. I needed to treat this emotional hostage situation like a corporate audit. In a forensic audit, you do not authorize a massive payout based on a frantic, threatening email. You verify the liability. You demand receipts. You call the vendor directly to confirm the invoice. I closed the banking application. I opened my mobile browser and typed in the name of the main medical center in our regional network. It was the only facility in the Treasure Valley equipped with a dedicated cardiovascular intensive care unit. If my father was suffering a major cardiac event, the emergency dispatchers would have transported him directly there. I tapped the main switchboard number. The phone rang twice before an automated voice directed me to the patient information directory. I pressed the corresponding number and waited. A generic instrumental jazz melody played through the speaker, contrasting sharply with the supposed life or death emergency unfolding across town. A woman picked up the line. "Patient information, how can I direct your call?" she asked in a tired, practiced tone. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice remarkably level despite the circumstances. "I am trying to locate a family member who was just brought into the emergency department with severe chest pains. His name is Richard Gonzalez." The clerk paused, likely typing the name into her terminal. "Can you provide his date of birth?" she asked. I recited his birth date, his home address, and the name of his primary care physician. I knew all of his medical details by heart because I had spent the better part of a decade managing his hypothetical care from afar, funding the co-payments and the pharmacy runs. "I hear typing," the clerk murmured. "Give me one moment, please." I gripped the edge of the mattress with my casted arm, ignoring the dull throb of pain shooting up my bicep. My heart hammered against my ribs. I braced myself to hear a room number. I mentally prepared to ask the clerk to transfer me to the attending physician so I could provide a credit card number over the phone to bypass the billing department. "I am sorry," the clerk finally said. "I do not have a Richard Gonzalez registered in our system today." "Are you checking the emergency intake registry?" I asked, my brow furrowing in confusion. "He would have arrived via ambulance within the last hour. He might not be fully admitted yet." "I am looking at the live intake board for the entire Valley network," she clarified gently. "We have no patient by that name in the waiting room in triage or admitted to the cardiac wing. In fact, we have not had a Richard Gonzalez admitted to any of our affiliated facilities in the last 5 years. Would you like me to check the neighboring county hospital system, just in case?" "Yes, please," I whispered. "Check the urgent care clinics as well, if you can." The line went silent for another 30 seconds. The instrumental jazz returned, mocking my escalating dread. When the clerk came back, her voice was definitive. "Nothing in the neighboring county either, ma'am. No recent clinic visits. If he is receiving medical care right now, he is not at a registered hospital in this region." "Thank you for your time," I said. I ended the call. The phone slipped from my fingers and landed softly on the thin cotton blanket covering my legs. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water, shocking my nervous system into a state of pristine, crystalline awareness. My father was not having a heart attack. He was not lying on a gurney clutching his chest while machines beeped around him. He was likely sitting in his living room recliner, watching television, completely unaware that his wife had just weaponized his mortality to extort $5,000 from their injured daughter. The emergency was a fabrication. The lapsed insurance was a lie. The entire scenario was a calculated, predatory maneuver designed to bypass my silence and drain my bank account. The last lingering remnants of my familial guilt shattered into microscopic fragments. Any residual doubt I harbored about cutting them off vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, chilling disgust. My mother had looked at my closed wallet and decided the most effective way to pry it back open was to convince me I was murdering my own father. I laid my head back against the pillow and stared at the textured ceiling. The emotional abuse was entirely manufactured. The crisis was a phantom. If Diane was willing to invent a lethal cardiac event to secure $5,000 today, it forced a terrifying question into the forefront of my mind. What else had she invented over the last decade? I thought about the initial medical bill she showed me in that dark kitchen 9 years ago. I thought about the monthly transfers labeled Richard Medical. I had sent $900 every single month for 108 months to cover specialized care and premium prescriptions. I had funded a massive mortgage that was supposed to keep a secure roof over a dying man's head. But the hospital clerk just confirmed my father had not been admitted to a regional facility in 5 years. If Richard was not sick and the current medical bills were fake, where did nearly $500,000 actually go? The money had to exist somewhere. It left my account on the first of every month, but it clearly never reached a hospital billing department or a pharmacy counter. My mother had hidden the truth behind a thick smokescreen of manufactured guilt and filial obligation. But I was a forensic auditor. I tracked missing assets for a living. I found money that wealthy executives tried to hide in offshore shell corporations. Tracing a decade of domestic wire transfers would be effortless. I just needed to pull the data. I reached for my phone again, my eyes narrowing. I was no longer a scared daughter waiting for a medical update. I was an investigator opening a fraud case. And the primary suspect had just provided me with the motive to dig up every single financial skeleton buried in her backyard. The afternoon sun dipped behind the heavy winter clouds, turning the light inside my hospital room a muted, clinical gray. Outside the city of Boise remained frozen. I received a brief text message from Mark. The airport in Seattle was still under a ground stop due to ice accumulation on the runways. He was booked into a terminal hotel for another night, pacing a small room, agonizing over his inability to reach me and our newborn daughter. I typed a quick reply, assuring him Lily was sleeping peacefully under the care of the private nurse and that my own pain was manageable. I set the phone down. His absence was a jagged ache in my chest. But as the silence settled over the room again, I realized it was also a tactical advantage. I was entirely alone. There were no nurses scheduled for rounds over the next 2 hours. There were no visitors to entertain. There was no one to monitor my reaction or interrupt my focus. I had the isolation required to dismantle a decade of deception. My father was not dying in a cardiac unit. That lie had severed the final tether of my familial loyalty. But uncovering a lie is only the first step of an investigation. A forensic auditor does not stop at discovering a falsehood. An auditor hunts for the underlying asset. If nearly $500,000 had not been spent on prescription beta blockers and emergency medical co-payments, I needed to know exactly where the capital had flowed. I needed a starting point. I closed my eyes and sifted through my recent memories, looking for anomalies. Fraud leaves a specific kind of debris. People who misappropriate funds always make mistakes. They leave paper trails, careless receipts, or unexplained behavioral shifts. I cataloged the last year of interactions with my mother, analyzing her habits, her complaints, and the physical environment of her home. A memory crystallized in my mind, sharp and vivid. It was 6 months ago, a standard Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I had arrived early to help prepare the meal. I was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables near the center island. A stack of sorted mail sat near the fruit bowl. My eyes had drifted over the envelopes, landing on a piece of high-quality, heavy cardstock. It was an oversized postcard, printed in deep metallic hues, boasting gold foil lettering. The front of the mailer featured a sweeping photograph of a luxury resort and gaming floor. The return address printed in the corner belonged to a high-end casino located in Jackpot, Nevada, a border town situated just a few hours south of Idaho. The bold text across the front offered a complimentary weekend suite and premium dining vouchers, a promotion exclusively reserved for Diamond Tier VVIP members. Before I could read the name printed on the mailing label, Diane had lunged across the kitchen. Her hand darted out, snatching the glossy cardstock from the counter with startling speed. She crumpled it into a tight ball and shoved it deep into the trash can under the sink. When I asked her about it, she let out a loud, forced laugh. Her eyes darted away from mine, avoiding direct contact. Just predatory junk mail, she had said, her voice a pitch higher than normal. Those scam resorts buy mailing lists from the grocery store loyalty programs and target senior citizens. It is disgusting how they try to prey on people on fixed incomes. I had accepted the explanation without a second thought. I believed she was a struggling fixed-income housewife, terrified of medical debt. I had no reason to suspect the woman weeping over my father's hypothetical funeral was actually a recognized high roller at a border town casino. The memory clicked into place like a key turning the tumbler of a heavy lock. The glossy mailer was not junk. It was a symptom of a massive hidden hemorrhage. I pressed the call button pinned to my bedsheet. A young orderly appeared in the doorway a minute later. I asked him to retrieve the leather work tote that the paramedics had recovered from the floorboards of my wrecked SUV. He returned with the bag, setting it carefully on the edge of my mattress. I thanked him and waited for the door to click shut. Reaching into the leather tote with my uninjured left hand, I bypassed my wallet and pulled out my company-issued iPad Pro. The device was heavy, encased in a rugged, protective shell that had saved it during the crash. I managed to unfold the kickstand and prop the screen upright on my plastic hospital tray table. I ignored the sharp protest of my broken ribs as I adjusted my posture to view the display. The physical pain was irrelevant now. My mind was sharp, operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a machine booting up. I tapped the screen and entered my alphanumeric passcode. I bypassed the standard applications and opened the encrypted corporate portal. I authenticated my identity using a secondary security key and accessed our proprietary data visualization software. It was the same program I used to track embezzled corporate funds, unmask offshore holding companies, and trace laundered assets across international borders. I linked the software directly to my personal banking dashboard. I configured the parameters for the data extraction. I selected a custom date range, setting the starting point back exactly 108 months, 9 years of financial history. I instructed the program to isolate every single outbound transaction originating from my checking account that terminated in the routing transit numbers associated with Diane and Richard. I pressed execute. The screen turned a dark slate gray. A thin blue progress bar appeared in the center, slowly inching toward the right. In consumer banking, when you wire money to another person, your statement simply shows the name of the recipient and the amount transferred. But digital currency does not just sit in a vacuum. Once it lands in the destination account, it has to be utilized. When a forensic program interfaces with banking application programming interfaces, it can track the subsequent clearinghouse data. It can identify the geographic location of the merchant terminals and automated teller machines where those specific funds were ultimately withdrawn. The blue bar crawled across the screen. 50%. 70%. I sat back against the pillows and watched the processor work. I was no longer a daughter searching for an apology. I was not a victim seeking closure. The woman who craved maternal validation had been crushed on the interstate. The entity staring at the iPad was a lead auditor building an airtight prosecution case against a thief. The progress bar hit 100%. The screen flashed, processing thousands of lines of raw, comma-separated values, translating the sterile rows of data into a visual interface. A digital map of the Pacific Northwest rendered on the display. If my mother had been telling the truth, the financial footprint would be entirely localized. The map would show heavy concentrations of capital being deployed within the Boise city limits. The data points would cluster around the addresses of the regional medical centers, the local pharmacies, the utility companies, and the county property tax collection offices. Instead, the map generated a spatial heat signature that told a vastly different story. Tiny red dots began to populate the screen, representing individual points of transaction. A few scattered dots appeared around local grocery stores and gas stations in our hometown. But the overwhelming majority of the red markers bypassed the local infrastructure entirely. The software aggregated the endpoints, drawing thick digital lines connecting the origin of my money to its final resting place. A massive, glowing red cluster erupted on the map, hundreds of miles away from the hypothetical medical crisis. The geographic coordinates were unmistakable. The vast majority of my labor, my sacrificed savings, and my compromised future had been systematically drained through automated teller machines located inside the city limits of Jackpot, Nevada. I zoomed in on the cluster. The geolocation data mapped perfectly onto the exact address printed on the glossy VIP mailer Diane had thrown in the trash. The initial hypothesis was confirmed. The money was flowing across the state line. But I needed the precise arithmetic. I needed to categorize the theft to understand the full scope of the illusion. I tapped the screen again, instructing the program to generate a categorized spreadsheet detailing the exact dollar amounts funneled into the gaming sector and calculating whatever fraction remained. The system began generating the final report. I watched the columns format themselves, preparing to reveal the exact mathematical anatomy of the mother who claimed she and her husband had always managed on their own. The processing icon vanished from my tablet display. A crisp, white digital ledger replaced the spinning wheel. Rows and columns organized 9 years of my life into undeniable mathematics. I adjusted my posture against the stiff hospital pillows. The dull ache in my chest receded. The sharp, focused energy of a lead investigator replaced my physical discomfort. Out of $486,000, the distribution was a masterpiece of parasitic theft. The interface categorized the raw data into neat, distinct pillars of expenditure. I just needed to walk through the ruins. I tapped the first column header, Richard Medical. I commanded the software to filter out legitimate healthcare expenditures by isolating registered medical merchant codes. The program verified co-payments, pharmacy receipts, and regional clinic visits. The total sum calculated at the bottom of the screen, $65,000. Over the course of a decade, my father required roughly $7,000 a year to manage his mild cardiac condition. It was a very real, manageable expense. Diane had used a sliver of truth to build a mountain of extortion. She took a routine prescription and dressed it up as a terminal crisis to justify the ongoing monthly drain. I remembered the phone calls where she would sigh heavily, claiming the new specialist was out of network. I remembered skipping my own dental appointments just to make sure I had enough cushion to cover his fabricated emergencies. She had auctioned off my peace of mind, using her husband's heart as the gavel. Next, I expanded the largest wedge of the financial pie chart. The cluster of red data points in Jackpot, Nevada required exact categorization. I highlighted the automated teller machine withdrawal logs, the screen populated with hundreds of individual line items. $200 here, $500 there, weekend spikes extending into the thousands. The final tally landed like a physical blow. $290,000. More than $250,000 had been pulled from cash dispensers located inside casino lobbies. I closed my eyes and visualized the reality of those numbers. While I was packing my lunches in plastic containers and calculating grocery budgets down to the cent, my mother was sitting on padded velvet stools, mindlessly feeding my salary into glowing slot machines. The woman who claimed she and her husband always managed on their own was actually a high-stakes gambling addict, subsidizing her compulsion with the sweat of her oldest daughter. Every time she posted a boastful message in the family group chat about her independence, she was likely sitting in a comped hotel suite I had unknowingly purchased for her. The remaining missing capital formed a distinct, steady river, flowing in an entirely different direction. I isolated the third column, direct bank transfers. The recipient routing number matched an account registered to Ashley. I scrutinized the timestamps and merchant codes. The total was staggering, $120,000. I opened a separate browser window and logged into my sister's public social media profile. I cross-referenced the dates of the outbound wire transfers with her timeline. The correlation was exact and nauseating. A transfer of $4,000 aligned perfectly with a photograph of her posing in front of a leased luxury sport utility vehicle. An outbound wire of $5,000 preceded a string of posts showing her sipping coconut water on a private beach in Tulum, Mexico. Ashley constantly lectured me about needing freedom to cultivate her personal brand. In reality, I was the unseen silent partner bankrolling her entire fake influencer lifestyle. My sister was not an independent creative force. She was a dependent beneficiary of stolen goods. Her complaint earlier this morning about a declined resort card made perfect sense now. Diane had not suffered a bank glitch. Diane had simply run out of my money to forward to her favorite child. There was one final category left to audit, the $2,000 a month designated for the Gonzalez mortgage. I had sent that specific amount without fail, believing it kept a secure roof over my parents' heads. Diane would frequently complain about fluctuating property taxes and adjustable interest rates to justify the high monthly sum. To verify the destination of these funds, I needed to look beyond my own banking ledger. I opened a new tab on my tablet browser and navigated to the Ada County Assessor Public Database. Property records are public domain in Idaho. I typed in the exact address of my childhood home. The deed history populated instantly on the screen. I scanned the chronological list of liens, loans, and recorded titles. I traced my left index finger along the smooth glass, reading the official county documentation. The sickening reality of the ultimate lie settled deep into my bones. The house had no active lien. The original mortgage was released and recorded as satisfied 2 decades ago. There was never a mortgage for me to pay. The constant threat of foreclosure was a pure, unadulterated fabrication. Diane had invented a non-existent housing crisis to secure a permanent, untraceable slush fund. Every tear she shed over losing the family home was a calculated performance designed to keep my wallet open. The investigation was complete. The conflict had officially morphed from a familial misunderstanding into documented, calculated financial abuse. I needed physical proof. I could not rely on a digital screen that could be dismissed as a technological glitch or a hacked document. I needed a tangible weapon. I noticed a compact wireless printer sitting on the nurse charting desk in the corner of my room. I navigated to the device settings and connected my tablet to the local hospital network. I formatted the forensic summary into a single, clean page. 12 rows of irrefutable data summarizing 9 years of theft. I pressed print. The machine whirred to life. The mechanical hum filled the quiet room, breaking the heavy silence. A single sheet of warm paper slid into the output tray. I threw off the thin hospital blanket. Ignoring the sharp protests from my fractured ribs, I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. My bare feet hit the cold linoleum floor. I walked slowly over to the desk and picked up the printed summary. I held the page in my uninjured hand. The spreadsheet was no longer just a collection of numbers. It was a loaded weapon. I had the ammunition to destroy the matriarchal myth Diane had spent a lifetime building. But as I stared at the 12 rows of theft, a chilling realization crept into my mind. Diane had manipulated every single relative in our orbit. She had weaponized Aunt Susan. She had bought Ashley's loyalty. She had terrified my father into silence. I held the ultimate truth in my hand. But standing alone in a sterile room, I had to face a terrifying question. Who in this deeply infected family could I possibly trust with the evidence? I carried the single sheet of warm paper back to the mattress. The black ink printed across the page felt heavy in my hand. I folded the spreadsheet in half and slid it beneath my pillow. The physical evidence was secured, but the emotional terrain remained fractured. I stared at the blank television mounted high on the opposite wall. The clinical room was a fortress, yet the quiet inside it felt suffocating. The storm outside had sealed the city in a frozen dome, mirroring the chill settling into my bones. My mobile device vibrated on the tray table. The caller identification displayed Richard, my father. My chest tightened, pulling at the fractured ribs. I had just proved his cardiovascular emergencies were a fabricated extortion tactic designed to drain my savings. But hearing his name still triggered a primal, daughterly instinct. Richard was a man who spent his life shrinking into the background of our childhood. While Diane commanded the dining room with theatrical saws and manufactured crises, he retreated to the garage. He smelled of sawdust and motor oil, hiding behind lawnmower engines and neatly organized pegboards. He traded his authority for peace, preferring to let his wife rule rather than face her wrath. I tapped the green icon and lifted the receiver to my ear. "Dad," I said. My tone remained guarded, carrying the cool detachment of an auditor rather than the warmth of a child. "Natty," he breathed. The old nickname scraped against the quiet hospital air. His voice sounded thin, carrying a distinct tremor I had not heard since I was a teenager. "I just saw the group chat. I saw what your mother posted about the money." I stayed silent. I needed to hear his position before revealing my ammunition. I needed to know if he was calling as an emissary of the matriarch or if he was calling as an independent actor. "I did not know the transfers stopped," he whispered. The cadence of his speech was rushed, fearful. The audio crackled, indicating he was likely hiding in a closet or pacing the far corner of the basement. "She handles the banking. I never wanted you carrying the load by yourself. I told her years ago it was too much pressure for a young woman. I told her we needed to downsize. A flicker of warmth ignited in my chest. A dangerous, intoxicating spark of hope flared against my better judgment. My father was acknowledging the burden. He was separating himself from the extortion. If he knew Diane was squandering my labor, maybe he was a victim too. Maybe he was trapped in that house, suffocated by her hidden gambling debts, waiting for someone to pull him from the wreckage. If we teamed up, we could break the cycle. Dad? I started keeping my voice low and steady. She texted me 2 hours ago claiming you were in the emergency room. She demanded $5,000 for a cardiac deposit. I called the regional dispatch. I checked the intake boards. I know you are not sick. I know the mortgage is paid off, and I know about the casino in Jackpot. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the speaker. Richard froze. The silence stretched thick and brittle, spanning the miles between the hospital bed and my childhood home. Then the audio quality changed. The muffled, frantic scraping of a palm covering the microphone brushed against my ear. Through the gaps in his fingers, a second voice bled into the transmission. It was sharp, authoritative, and deeply impatient. "Who are you talking to, Richard?" Diane demanded. The background acoustics indicated she had just walked into his sanctuary. "Is that Susan? Tell her I need her to pick up the dry cleaning before the roads freeze again." The microphone uncovered. The fragile, trembling man seeking absolution vanished. In a fraction of a second, his posture snapped back into the obedient, subservient mold Diane had crafted for him. The courage evaporated, replaced by a hollow, flattened surrender. The father who wanted to protect his daughter was instantly replaced by the husband, terrified of his wife. "I have to go," Richard said. The warmth was gone. His tone was robotic, scrubbed clean of any treasonous affection. "You are going to let her do this," I stated. It was not a question. It was a verdict. I pictured him standing in his garage, staring at his boots, refusing to meet Diane's gaze, while he betrayed his own flesh and blood. "Just feel better, Natalie," he muttered. The call disconnected. The dead air hummed in my ear. I lowered the device to my lap. The spark of hope extinguished, leaving behind a cold gray ash. I had always categorized my father as a collateral casualty of Diane's tyranny. I spent a decade funneling my paycheck into their joint accounts because I believed his passive nature made him vulnerable. I thought I was shielding a gentle, aging man from a harsh reality. That brief phone call rewrote our entire history. Richard was not a casualty. He was a willing hostage. He knew the financial strain I endured. He knew his wife was extracting my future to fund her own leisure. He recognized the injustice, but he actively chose his own comfort over my survival. Confronting Diane required bravery. It required conflict. It meant disrupting the fragile, toxic peace of his household. He decided my indentured servitude was an acceptable price to pay for his quiet evenings in the recliner. Cowardice is a quiet weapon, but it cuts just as deep as active malice. Diane wielded guilt and lies, striking from the front. Richard wielded silence, stabbing from the back. By refusing to intervene, he endorsed the theft. By hanging up the phone to appease his wife, he cemented his role as an accomplice. His failure to protect his child was a deliberate, calculated decision to protect himself. The gravity of my isolation settled over the hospital bed like a lead apron. The Gonzalez family machine was an impenetrable unit designed to crush dissent. Diane supplied the aggression, Ashley provided the vanity, Aunt Susan delivered the moral high ground, and Richard maintained the enabling silence. They all fed the ecosystem, ensuring the gears kept turning, grinding down anyone who dared to question the established order. I looked at the heavy plaster on my arm. I felt the sharp bite of the fractured ribs. I was a battered woman, trapped in a snowed-in medical facility, holding a spreadsheet that proved my mother was a criminal. But evidence requires a judge. A trial requires an impartial jury. In a family constructed entirely on lies and willful blindness, raw data is useless if no one is willing to look at it. If I presented the printed ledger to my father, he would simply close his eyes and hand it to Diane. If I showed it to Susan, she would quote a scripture about forgiveness and burn the page. The financial autopsy resting beneath my pillow was the ultimate truth, but standing alone against an entire bloodline devoted to a shared delusion, my truth felt incredibly fragile. I had uncovered the theft. I had severed the funding. Yet without a single ally to witness the reality of the spreadsheet, I was just a rogue element they would eventually unite to destroy. If my own father would let me be slaughtered on the altar of his wife's ego to save his own skin, I had to wonder if there was anyone left in this world who could validate my reality. The isolation inside the clinical room hardened into a physical weight. The afternoon light filtering through the frosted glass shifted from bright white to a bruised, dusky purple. Outside, the city remained entombed in ice. Inside, I was entombed in a profound, suffocating silence. My father had chosen submission over his own daughter. My mother was actively campaigning for my destruction. My sister was demanding I fix her vacation funds. The spreadsheet tucked beneath my pillow was a flawless ledger of theft, yet without a single witness willing to look at the math, the numbers felt completely useless. I closed my eyes and focused on the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator. I prepared my mind for a long, solitary war. I accepted that I would have to fight the Gonzalez machine entirely alone, navigating the upcoming smear campaigns and financial retaliations without a single ally standing at my back. Then the heavy, solid core door of my room unlatched. It did not swing open with the brisk, efficient energy of a triage nurse. It opened slowly, pushed by a deliberate, measured force. A distinct sound echoed against the polished linoleum floor, a dull, rhythmic thud. Wood striking synthetic tile. I turned my head against the stiff pillow. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped across the threshold. He wore a faded canvas barn coat, the heavy fabric carrying the faint, crisp scent of freezing ozone and aged cedar. A wide-brimmed felt hat was clutched in his left hand, dusted with melting snow. In his right hand, he leaned his weight onto a scarred hickory walking stick. It was my grandfather, Hector. He was 78 years old, a retired cattle rancher who had spent his entire life working the unforgiving high desert terrain of southern Idaho. His face was a topographic map of deep creases, weathered by decades of sun and biting wind. He was Diane's father, the undisputed patriarch of our bloodline, a man whose quiet authority commanded absolute respect in every room he entered. While my mother ruled her household through theatrical tantrums and manufactured guilt, Hector governed through stoic, unwavering competence. He did not bring cheerful helium balloons. He did not carry a vase of overpriced hospital flowers. Tucked securely under his left arm, pressed tightly against his ribs, was a thick, bulging manila dossier. The cardboard edges were frayed and soft from age. The contents were secured by two thick beige rubber bands that looked brittle and dry-rotted, indicating the package had been sealed for a very long time. Hector stopped at the foot of my bed. His piercing dark eyes scanned the length of my body. He assessed the heavy plaster cast anchoring my arm. He cataloged the dark purple bruising blooming along my jawline. He noted the clear plastic tubing delivering oxygen into my nostrils. His jaw muscles tightened, flexing beneath his weathered skin. It was a subtle, microscopic shift, but on a man carved from stone, it was the equivalent of a primal scream. He moved toward the vinyl visitor chair positioned beside my tray table. He lowered his tall frame into the seat, resting his gnarled hands on the rounded head of his wooden cane. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not ask if I was feeling better, because the answer was obvious. I knew, Hector said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, vibrating with a quiet, suppressed fury. I always knew, he repeated, holding my gaze. A tight, painful knot, situated deep in the center of my chest, suddenly unraveled. The sheer force of his validation washed over me, a powerful narcotic, instantly numbing the psychological burns my parents had inflicted. I was not crazy. I was not alone. The patriarch of the family had crossed a frozen city during a historic blizzard to sit beside my bed. You knew about the money. I whispered, my voice trembling, for the very first time since the accident. He nodded slowly. He released his grip on the cane and reached for the thick cardboard dossier resting on his lap. He ran a calloused thumb over the brittle rubber bands. Your grandmother was a bookkeeper, Natalie, he explained. For 40 years, she balanced the ledgers for a commercial livestock operation. She could spot a misplaced decimal point from a mile away. When she retired, she kept her mind sharp. She noticed things. She noticed Diane wearing designer labels on a fixed income. She noticed the unexplainable weekend trips. She noticed the brand new vehicles appearing in Ashley's driveway. I listened, utterly captivated by the revelation. My grandmother had passed away nearly 2 years ago. She was a brilliant, observant woman, and I had always admired her quiet intelligence. Your mother thought she was clever, Hector continued, a bitter edge sharpening his tone. Diane assumed because we were old, we were blind. She claimed she and Richard were thriving on savvy investments. But your grandmother knew Richard never had the spine for the stock market, and Diane never had the discipline for savings. So my wife started her own audit. Hector leaned forward, the vinyl chair squeaking under his shifting weight. She tracked the mileage on Diane's odometer, he said. She cross-referenced the dates Diane claimed she was at a spiritual retreat with the promotional calendars of the border town casinos. 2 years ago, right before her health failed, your grandmother drove herself down to Jackpot, Nevada. She walked onto the gaming floor of the largest resort in town. She stood behind a row of progressive slot machines and watched her own daughter feed $100 bills into a terminal for 3 straight hours. The image painted a sickeningly vivid picture in my mind. The matriarch of the family standing in the neon glow of a casino, witnessing her child squander a stolen future. When she confronted Diane privately, Hector rumbled, his eyes narrowing at the memory. Diane lied to her face. She claimed she was using casino promotional credits. She denied taking a single penny from you. But your grandmother knew the truth. She knew you were the only reliable revenue stream in that house. She knew Diane was bleeding your savings dry to fund a sickness. I pulled the thin cotton blanket tighter around my shoulders. Why didn't she tell me? I asked, the betrayal stinging the edges of my relief. Why let me keep paying? Because warning you would only stop the bleeding temporarily, Hector stated his logic, cold and impenetrable. Diane is a predator. If you cut off her supply, she would just invent a new crisis to manipulate you. Your grandmother realized that exposing the theft was not enough. We needed to build an ironclad defense. We needed to construct a permanent structural barrier that Diane could never bypass, no matter how many tears she shed or how many medical emergencies she fabricated. He patted the thick manila package resting on his knees. The sound was a dull, heavy smack. She ran out of time before she could finish. The deployment, Hector murmured, a shadow of grief passing over his weathered features. Her heart gave out. But before she passed, she made me promise to finalize the architecture. She made me swear I would hold the line until the exact right moment presented itself. She knew a day would come when Diane's greed would finally cross a line you could not ignore. He looked at my shattered wrist. He looked at the bruises coloring my neck. I believe we have officially reached that day, he declared. The balance of power in the universe fundamentally shifted. I had spent the last 12 hours believing I was a rogue element fighting an insurmountable war. I was wrong. I was merely the final piece of a retaliatory campaign orchestrated by a brilliant bookkeeper from beyond the grave. The spreadsheet currently hidden beneath my pillow was not my only weapon. It was just the opening salvo. I reached under the cotton fabric and pulled out the single sheet of paper I had printed. I unfolded the document and handed it across the gap. I pulled the banking data this afternoon, I said. $486,000. Most of it went to the slot machines in Nevada. The rest went to Ashley. Hector took the paper. He did not gasp. He did not express shock. He simply scanned the 12 rows of irrefutable mathematics, his expression hardening into a mask of pure granite. He folded the spreadsheet meticulously and tucked it beneath the brittle rubber bands of his dossier, marrying my digital evidence with his physical archive. "We are going to end this, Natalie," he commanded. I nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline flood my system. I can call a lawyer tomorrow. I can send the banking logs to Aunt Susan and the cousins. I can post the spreadsheet directly into the family group chat and expose her lies to everyone. No, Hector interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with absolute authority. "Digital exposure is sloppy," he explained. "Diane thrives on internet drama. If you post a document online, she will claim it is doctored. She will play the victim. She will spin a web of excuses and rally the relatives to defend her honor. To kill a parasite, you must drag it into the blinding light. You cannot confront a narcissist in the shadows, and you cannot defeat a performer through a screen." He planted his walking stick firmly against the linoleum tile, gripping the polished wooden handle. "We are going to give your mother exactly what she wants." Hector promised, a dangerous glint illuminating his dark eyes. "She loves an audience. We are going to provide her with the largest audience she has ever had. We are going to handle this properly, in the physical world, in front of everyone she has ever lied to." He tapped the thick cardboard package resting on his lap one final time. The gesture was deliberate, loaded with profound implication. I stared at the frayed edges of the mystery bundle. The spreadsheet proved the theft, but a spreadsheet does not require a sprawling, sealed dossier. My grandmother had spent her final months building a permanent structural barrier. I looked at the stoic rancher sitting beside me, my mind racing with 100 different possibilities. The manila folder clearly contained a legal bomb designed to obliterate Diane's kingdom, but I was left burning with a single, consuming question. What exact mechanism did a dying bookkeeper leave behind to protect her granddaughter? The heavy manila folder rested on my grandfather's lap like a dormant explosive. Hector kept his weathered hands firmly planted on the polished wooden handle of his cane. He had just handed me the ultimate validation, confirming that my entire reality was not a hallucination. Yet before he mobilized our retaliatory strike, he remained seated in the vinyl visitor chair. The fierce, protective anger radiating from his posture slowly softened into a profound, mournful sorrow. He looked at my bruised face, and I saw the heavy burden of a parent recognizing the catastrophic failures of his own child. "You have spent your entire adult life analyzing risk," Natalie Hector began. His gravelly voice filled the quiet clinical space, cutting through the steady hum of the oxygen concentrator. "You trace missing capital. You find the logical explanation for why a ledger does not balance. But you have been trying to apply corporate logic to a psychological disease. You cannot fix Diane by giving her more money, because her deficit is not financial. Her deficit is located deep inside her soul." I adjusted my position against the stiff hospital pillows, ignoring the sharp protest in my chest. For 32 years, I had viewed my mother as an unpredictable force of nature. I treated her moods like weather patterns, seeking shelter when she stormed, and basking in the rare moments she offered sunlight. I had never dared to dissect the underlying pathology driving her behavior. Hector shifted his weight, his eyes drifting toward the frosted window pane staring out into the frozen Boise evening. "Your mother grew up on a working cattle ranch," he explained. "It was an unforgiving environment that demanded constant labor. She had an older brother. He was charismatic, naturally gifted, and effortlessly capable. He drew attention without trying. Diane spent her formative years standing in his shadow. Instead of stepping into the sunlight and building her own identity, she internalized a toxic, festering jealousy. She convinced herself that the universe had cheated her. She adopted a bitter, lifelong victimhood, believing destiny owed her an unpayable debt. I listened, utterly fascinated by this hidden chapter of family history. The portrait he painted aligned perfectly with the woman I knew. Diane was constantly comparing her life to others, forever convinced she was being deprived of luxury and status. When she married Richard, she thought she was securing a provider who would elevate her, Hector murmured, shaking his head slightly. But your father is a passive man. He lacked the aggressive ambition she craved. Her grand illusions of wealth never materialized, so she decided to extract that status from her own offspring. He turned his dark, piercing gaze back to me. "Then you were born," he stated. "You were a quiet infant. You became a fiercely independent toddler. You tied your own shoes early, finished your homework without being reminded, and navigated the world with a quiet competence. You did not need constant rescuing." I nodded, remembering my childhood. I had always prided myself on requiring minimal supervision. I thought being invisible and helpful was the best way to earn her love. "That independence was your greatest curse," my grandfather revealed, a sharp edge of tragedy threading through his words. Narcissists do not know what to do with a self-sufficient child. They cannot extract any ego validation from someone who functions perfectly well without their intervention. Because you did not require a savior, Diane stripped you of your daughterly status and reassigned you. She turned you into an appliance. You became the utility vehicle. You were designated the load-bearing wall, expected to hold up the ceiling while everyone else danced in the living room. The analogy struck me with the force of a physical blow. The grooming was not an accident. It was a structural necessity for her warped ecosystem. Then Ashley arrived, Hector continued. From the moment she took her first breath, your sister was loud, erratic, and utterly demanding. She required constant appeasement. She was terrified of the dark, incapable of managing her own schedule, and prone to massive theatrical breakdowns. Hector paused, letting the contrast settle between us. Diane flourished, he concluded. She finally found her purpose. With Ashley, your mother could play the role of the magnificent, indispensable queen. She could swoop in, solve the manufactured crises, and bathe in the adoration of a dependent child. She created a golden child because she desperately needed an audience to worship her. The pieces of the psychological puzzle snapped together with pristine, devastating clarity. The entire family dynamic was a stage play, directed by a woman compensating for her own historic insecurities. But playing the benevolent, wealthy savior requires vast amounts of capital, I whispered, completing the equation aloud. Exactly, Hector confirmed. Diane refused to seek employment. Richard brought in a modest pension. The kingdom was bankrupt. So she targeted the most reliable, capable resource in her orbit. She targeted the pack mule. She used your filial loyalty to harvest your paycheck, funneling your labor into Ashley's bank account to secure her own status as the ultimate provider, while simultaneously feeding her gambling addiction to simulate the lifestyle she believed she was owed. I sat in the sterile hospital bed processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. It was a flawless, predatory loop. I was sacrificing my future to fund my sister's vanity, simply because my mother required a delusion of grandeur to survive her own insecurities. Hector leaned forward. He reached out and gently placed his calloused, weathered hand over my uninjured left fingers. "Understanding her sickness does not absolve her crimes," he commanded, his voice dropping into a solemn, definitive register. "Tracing the origin of a poison does not mean you are required to drink it. It is not an excuse, Natalie. It is just the shape of the trap." Those words sank deep into my consciousness, providing a profound structural closure I did not know I needed. For the first time in my life, I stopped wondering what I had done wrong to earn her dismissal. Diane was a complex, tragic villain, driven by a hollow void she would never be able to fill. I could not cure her. I could only remove myself from the blast radius. Hector retracted his hand and gripped his walking stick. He pushed his tall frame upward, rising from the vinyl chair. He secured the thick manila dossier under his arm. "Rest tonight," my grandfather instructed, adjusting the brim of his felt hat. "Gather your strength. I am going to make a few phone calls. We will let the enemy make the next move. And when she does, we will be ready." He offered a single, resolute nod, then turned and walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving a residue of absolute fortification in his wake. Less than 20 minutes later, the door swung open again. This time the pacing was frantic. Mark burst into the room. He wore a heavy winter parka dusted with melting ice. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, his hair disheveled from spending 36 hours trapped inside an airport terminal. He carried the sharp, distinct scent of freezing air and stale roasted coffee. He dropped his duffel bag onto the linoleum floor and crossed the distance between us in 3 massive strides. He leaned over the mattress, wrapping his arms around my shoulders, burying his face into the crook of my neck. He was incredibly careful to avoid putting pressure on my fractured ribs, but his grip was fiercely protective. I made it. Mark exhaled his breath, warm against my skin. I went down to the pediatric ward first. I saw Lily. She is perfect. The private nurse is amazing. I closed my eyes and leaned into his embrace. The tears I had refused to shed for my mother finally spilled over my eyelashes. They were not tears of grief. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. My actual family had finally arrived. The man holding me was the true architect of my future, a partner who navigated a historic blizzard just to stand by my bed. We stayed like that for a long time, anchoring each other in the quiet, clinical space. I did not feel like a broken woman anymore. The emotional fractures had been set and splinted by my grandfather's revelations. I pulled back slightly and looked into Mark's exhausted, loving eyes. I had a monumental task ahead of me, but I was fully armored. I possessed the forensic banking data. I possessed the unwavering loyalty of the family patriarch. And I possessed the emotional bedrock of a devoted husband. The defensive fortifications were complete. However, across the city, the Gonzalez matriarch was staring at a wallet full of declined credit cards. Diane was entirely out of funds. Her smear campaign had failed. Her fake cardiac emergency had been ignored. A predator deprived of its primary food source will invariably orchestrate a massive, desperate trap. I knew Diane was going to corner me. It was only a matter of time before she summoned the entire bloodline, leveraging the weight of a public audience to force her pack mule back into the harness. The digital clock on the bedside monitor indicated it was just past noon on Thursday. I was scheduled for discharge later in the afternoon. The doctors had cleared Lily to leave the pediatric step-down unit, meaning Mark and I were finally taking our newborn daughter home. He was currently downstairs finalizing the billing paperwork, leaving me alone in the quiet room to navigate the tedious task of packing my personal belongings with only one functioning arm. As I struggled to fold a hospital gown into my overnight bag, my mobile device vibrated against the plastic tray table. It was a notification from the Gonzalez family group thread. The same digital auditorium Diane had utilized 36 hours earlier to execute her public smear campaign. I unlocked the screen. The message was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Diane had composed a lengthy saccharine invitation designed to project the image of a benevolent, deeply wounded matriarch seeking reconciliation. "My dearest family," the message began, decorated with a string of heart emojis. "It has been an incredibly dark and challenging week for Richard and me. We have experienced a devastating misunderstanding with Natalie that has caused us immense pain. However, we are a family built on faith and forgiveness. We refuse to let anger fracture our bond. We are hosting a mandatory Sunday dinner this weekend to officially welcome baby Lily into the world. We want to clear the air, heal these wounds, and move forward together in love." I stared at the glowing pixels. "A mandatory Sunday dinner. I hope you will all join us," Diane continued in the group thread. "Natalie, we expect you and Mark to be there. We have a seat waiting for you at the table. Let us put this unfortunate selfishness behind us." Aunt Susan replied within 60 seconds. She posted a thumbs-up symbol, followed by a brief text. "We will be there, Diane. It is time for some people to remember their obligations." Amen. Several cousins chimed in with affirmative responses confirming their attendance. The trap was officially set. The bait had been deployed. Mark walked back into the room carrying a stack of discharge forms. He stopped in his tracks, noting the rigid posture I had adopted while staring at my device. He set the paperwork down and crossed the room, looking over my shoulder to read the glowing screen. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "A welcome home dinner," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "She literally abandoned your child for a cat 2 days ago. She lied about a heart attack to extort $5,000 from you yesterday. And now she expects you to sit at her dining room table and eat pot roast like nothing happened? "It is not a dinner, Mark," I said softly. I kept my gaze locked on the screen, analyzing the tactical layout of the invitation. It is an ambush. He walked around the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, careful to avoid my cast. "Explain it to me," he requested. I had spent my entire life studying Diane's strategic maneuvers. I knew exactly how she operated when she was cornered. She has realized that ignoring my texts and canceling her transfers is a tactic I can sustain indefinitely from a distance, I explained. She knows she cannot break me over the phone. Her credit cards are maxed out, and she needs the financial pipeline reopened immediately. I gestured toward the group thread on the screen. She summoned the entire extended family to our childhood home. I continued, my voice steady and analytical. She intends to use Aunt Susan, the cousins, and my father as a unified audience. She is banking on my lifelong, deeply ingrained habit of avoiding public confrontation. She assumes that if she corners me in front of 20 relatives, I will cave under the pressure. She expects me to apologize, accept her narrative that this was all a misunderstanding, and quietly resume the monthly payments just to escape the public humiliation. Mark frowned, his protective instincts flaring, his jaw clenched tight. "Then we are not going," he stated definitively. "We will block their numbers right now. We will take Lily home, lock the doors, and ignore them for the rest of our lives. You do not owe them an explanation, Natalie. You do not have to subject yourself to a firing squad just to prove a point." His logic was sound. Retreating into the safety of our own home was the rational, self-preserving choice. The old version of me would have leaped at the opportunity to avoid the conflict. The woman who spent 9 years funding a fiction would have hidden behind blocked numbers, allowing Diane to maintain her matriarchal illusion while playing the tragic victim to the rest of the bloodline. I reached under my pillow with my uninjured left hand. My fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper I had printed yesterday. I pulled out the spreadsheet summarizing 9 years of theft. The black ink categorized the $290,000 funneled into the Nevada slot machines. It documented the $120,000 wired to Ashley. It proved the Ada County property taxes were zero. I held the physical evidence in my hand. I thought about the thick, worn manila folder my grandfather was currently guarding. I thought about the profound structural barrier my grandmother had built before she died. I looked at Mark. My husband was a good, decent man who wanted to shield me from further trauma. But he did not understand that blocking a predator only delays the inevitable. A narcissist deprived of their primary resource does not simply accept defeat. Diane would escalate. She would show up uninvited at my corporate office. She would orchestrate a scene at Lily's daycare. She would spend the next decade poisoning my reputation among the extended relatives, forever casting me as the villain in her fabricated tragedy. To eliminate a parasite, you cannot just close the door. You have to burn the nest to the ground. "I am going to that dinner," I stated. Mark blinked, clearly taken aback by the cold, unwavering certainty in my tone. "Natalie, that is exactly what she wants. She wants you in that room so she can control the narrative. She wants an audience." "I know," I replied. A sharp, dangerous adrenaline flooded my veins, pushing away the residual exhaustion of the trauma ward. I am going to give her the audience. I smoothed the folded spreadsheet against my thigh, feeling the texture of the paper. I had spent 32 years serving as a reactive casualty in Diane's theatrical productions. I had always played the assigned role of the quiet, obedient mule, absorbing the emotional collateral damage while the golden child danced in the spotlight. I had never once written the script. I was officially done reacting. It was time to become the proactive orchestrator of justice. Mark stared into my eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation or fear. He found a woman entirely devoid of both. He saw a senior risk analyst preparing to execute a hostile corporate takeover of her own family tree. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked, his voice dropping into a solemn register. "Walking into that house means walking directly into a crossfire. They are going to attack you the second you cross the threshold." "I am sure," I promised. I folded the spreadsheet and tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of my overnight bag. I do not plan on surrendering Mark. I plan on letting the math speak for itself. He watched me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. If you are going into the lion's den, I am walking in right beside you. I will carry Lily. You carry the data. We finalized the packing in silence. The atmosphere in the room shifted from quiet recovery to the tense, focused energy of a staging ground before a major deployment. I was no longer a victim seeking shelter. I was a fully armed combatant, preparing to step onto a battlefield designed by my enemy. Diane believed she had constructed an inescapable snare. She assumed the combined weight of Aunt Susan's self-righteous indignation, Richard's cowardly silence, and the collective judgment of the extended family would force me into submission. She had assembled the entire cast of characters in my childhood home, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow to my rebellion. However, Diane possessed a fatal blind spot. She had severely miscalculated the psychological impact of leaving a bleeding daughter alone in a hospital room. She assumed I was walking into the ambush defenseless, carrying nothing but a guilty conscience and a fractured wrist. She had absolutely no idea that I was walking through her front door carrying a loaded financial spreadsheet backed by the fierce, unspoken alliance of the family patriarch. The stakes were monumental. The physical environment of the childhood home held decades of psychological triggers. I was preparing to cross the threshold into a house densely populated with people who were contractually obligated to misunderstand me. The upcoming collision was inevitable, and it was going to require an unprecedented level of emotional fortitude to survive the initial barrage. Sunday evening descended on the Treasure Valley with a biting sub-zero chill. The tires of our sedan crunched over the packed ice as Mark turned onto the familiar suburban street. I stared through the passenger window, watching the neighborhood materialize in the fading twilight. Street lamps cast long yellow shadows across manicured lawns buried under thick snowdrifts. We slowed to a halt in front of my childhood home. For nearly a decade, I had viewed this specific structure as a fragile sanctuary held together by my own financial sacrifice. I used to look at the painted shutters and the shingled roof, calculating the property taxes and the interest rates I believed I was covering. Now, knowing the deed had been fully satisfied 20 years ago, the house looked entirely different. It was no longer a home. It was a physical monument to a monumental grift. Mark shifted the vehicle into park and killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was thick, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of Lily sleeping in the back. I sat still for a moment, gathering my breath. The dull ache in my ribs was a persistent companion, and the plaster encasing my right arm felt heavier than usual. I reached into the deep pocket of my winter coat with my uninjured left hand. My fingers brushed against a strip of textured plastic. I pulled it out. It was the gray identification band from the hospital trauma ward. The edges were slightly frayed, the barcode smudged from days of friction against my skin. I had asked the discharge nurse to cut it off carefully so I could keep it intact. I unbuckled my seatbelt and twisted around to face the back seat. Lily was bundled in a thick pink blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. With meticulous, deliberate movements, I looped the gray plastic band around the sturdy carrying handle of her infant car seat. I pulled the end through the clasp, securing it tightly. Mark watched me from the driver's seat. He did not ask what I was doing. He understood the gravity of the gesture. That cheap piece of plastic was my anchor. It carried the faint, lingering scent of clinical antiseptic. It was the physical proof of the night I nearly bled to death on the interstate, while my mother chose to feed a cat. If the emotional pressure inside the house threatened to crack my resolve, all I had to do was look at that gray band to remember exactly who these people were. It was my armor. We stepped out into the freezing air. Mark unlatched the car seat, carrying Lily with a protective, unyielding grip. As we approached the shoveled walkway, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the sidewalk down the block. Grandpa Hector emerged from the deepening shadows. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, his leather boots crunching against the ice. The scarred hickory cane struck the pavement with each step, signaling his arrival like a metronome. Under his left arm, pressed tightly against his heavy canvas barn coat, rested the frayed manila folder. The brittle rubber bands held the cardboard shut. We met near the front porch. Hector did not offer a greeting. He simply looked at my cast, looked at the sleeping infant in Mark's hand, and gave a single, resolute nod. I reached out and turned the brass handle of the front door. Heat washed over us instantly, carrying the dense, savory aroma of roasted beef, root vegetables, and red wine. It was Diane's signature Sunday pot roast. That specific smell was the aromatic foundation of my childhood, a manufactured nostalgia designed to evoke warmth and traditional domesticity. Tonight, the scent felt heavy, almost suffocating, like a thick curtain designed to hide the rot underneath. The low hum of hushed conversation died the second we crossed the threshold. The living room was crowded. Diane had summoned an impressive audience. Aunt Susan sat rigid on the floral sofa, her hands folded primly in her lap, wearing the severe expression of a judge presiding over a tribunal. Two of my older cousins stood near the fireplace mantel, holding crystal wine glasses, their postures stiff and observational. Richard, my father, hovered near the hallway archway. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the baseboards, refusing to look in my direction. The cowardice rolling off him was palpable. Then Diane launched her performance. She appeared from the kitchen wearing a pristine floral blouse and an apron. Her eyes were already brimming with fresh, glistening tears. She clasped her hands over her heart, her face contorting into a mask of pure, tragic relief. "Oh, my sweet girl Diane," cried out, her voice quivering with theatrical emotion. She rushed forward, navigating the crowded room, her arms outstretched to embrace her prodigal daughter and her new granddaughter. She was playing the role of the benevolent, forgiving matriarch to perfection. She wanted the audience to witness her boundless grace in the face of my supposed cruelty. She reached for the handle of the car seat. Mark did not speak a single word. He simply pivoted his left shoulder, shifting his weight with the smooth, immovable grace of a concrete pillar. He stepped between Diane and our daughter, breaking her physical trajectory. He held the car seat slightly behind his leg, out of her reach. Diane stopped short. A microscopic flash of pure, venomous fury rippled across her features, vanishing so quickly that anyone blinking would have missed it. She seamlessly masked a rejection by pressing her fingertips to her lips, letting a single, tragic sob escape her throat. "I just wanted to see the baby," she whimpered, casting a wounded glance toward Aunt Susan to ensure the slight was properly registered by the jury. "Give them some space, Diane," Aunt Susan instructed from the sofa. Her tone was sharp and punitive, directed entirely at me. "They have a lot of explaining to do before we can act like a proper family again." I ignored the bait. I did not apologize for Mark's protective stance. I did not flinch under the collective glare of the room. I walked slowly toward the only vacant armchair favoring my bruised ribs and lowered myself into the upholstery. Mark remained standing right beside me, holding Lily. Hector moved to the corner of the room, leaning heavily on his cane, blending into the shadows like a silent observational sentinel. The manila folder remained securely tucked under his arm. The dramatic irony saturating the air was thick, heavy, and deeply intoxicating. Every single relative in that living room believed they held the superior position. They viewed me as a defenseless, guilty child who had been summoned to face a firing squad. They assumed my silence was a symptom of shame. They were waiting for me to break down, to offer a tearful apology, and to beg for my mother's forgiveness. Aunt Susan adjusted her glasses. The cousins sipped their wine, sharing knowing, judgmental glances. Richard continued to study the floorboards. Diane stood in the center of the room, drying her manufactured tears with a tissue, preparing to deliver her opening monologue. They had no idea. They did not know that nestled inside the inner pocket of my overnight bag was a forensic ledger detailing 9 years of predatory theft. They did not know about the casino withdrawals in Nevada or the phantom mortgage payments. And they certainly did not know that the quiet, elderly rancher standing in the corner held a legal document capable of stripping Diane of her entire kingdom. I settled into the armchair, resting my heavy plaster cast on the padded armrest. The gray hospital band dangling from Lily's car seat caught the warm ambient light of the living room lamps. I focused on my breathing, keeping my heart rate slow and even. I was a spectator watching a play where I already knew the final act. Diane cleared her throat, ensuring all eyes were on her. She clasped her hands together again, adopting a posture of profound sorrow mixed with maternal patience. She was about to initiate the prosecution. She was going to weave a tale of sacrifice and abandonment, setting the stage to demand my financial surrender. I watched her mouth open. The trap was sprung, the audience was seated, and the tension in the room coiled tight, ready to snap. I just had to wait for the exact moment she grew arrogant enough to deliver the fatal, unforgivable line. The dining room felt tight, the air thick with the lingering scent of roasted beef and the unspoken expectations of the jury. We relocated from the living room to the large oak table. Ashley occupied the chair directly across from me. She had flown back from her ruined vacation yesterday. Her nose was peeling from the sunburn she complained about during our video call. She kept her eyes glued to her phone screen, radiating petulant annoyance over her declined credit cards. She did not ask how my ribs felt. She did not ask about her new niece. She merely existed in her own bubble of inconvenience. Plates were pushed aside. Diane stood at the head of the table. She smoothed the front of her pristine floral blouse and let out a long, ragged sigh. The performance commenced. She looked toward Aunt Susan, seeking her primary validator. "This has been the hardest week of my life," Diane began. Her voice carried a practiced, trembling vibrato. She described her anxiety. She labeled my silence as cruel, unexplained spite. She painted herself as a struggling, devoted mother who asked for a tiny bit of grace and received a knife in the back. Aunt Susan nodded in solemn agreement, pressing her lips into a thin line of disapproval. Richard stared at his empty water glass, refusing to lift his head. Diane turned her gaze to me, her eyes brimming with fresh, manufactured moisture. "I just do not understand it, Natalie. We raised you to care about your blood. We gave you everything we had. We supported you." She gestured toward the opposite side of the table. "Look at your sister," Diane pleaded. Ashley briefly glanced up from her device, looking confused by her sudden inclusion in the monologue. Diane delivered the final, fatal error. She handed me the exact weapon she used to abandon my daughter in the trauma ward. "Your sister never has these emergencies." The room held its breath. Aunt Susan prepared to nod again. The cousins waited for my tearful apology. They expected the fractured, guilty daughter to beg for readmission into the fold. I did not give them the reaction they anticipated. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. The frantic, anxious child who used to manage everyone else's feelings was dead. A senior risk analyst sat in her place. I reached into my overnight bag with my uninjured left hand. My fingers found the crisp edge of the folded paper. I pulled the document out and smoothed it flat against my thigh. "You are right, Mom," I said. My voice was pitched to the exact level frequency I use during corporate audit presentations. It was cold, clinical, and devoid of any emotional vulnerability. Ashley never has these emergencies. I think it is time we examine exactly why that is. I slid the paper across the polished oak surface. It stopped in the exact center of the table, resting directly under the glow of the overhead chandelier. The black ink stood out against the stark white page. "This is a categorized ledger of every dollar I have sent to this house over the last 108 months, I explained. The total is $486,000. When I announced the total sum, the ambient noise in the house seemed to cease entirely. The hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen faded. The distant howling of the winter wind outside became non-existent. The only sound was my own steady, regulated breathing. The cousins stopped breathing. Aunt Susan leaned forward, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Richard squeezed his eyes shut. The top row is real, I stated, tracing the line with my eyes. $65,000 went to genuine medical care for Dad, co-payments and prescriptions. The rest of the ledger is the part where you claim you always managed on your own. I let my gaze lock onto Diane. The color was already beginning to drain from her cheeks. $290,000 was withdrawn in cash from automated teller machines located in Jackpot, Nevada, I revealed, letting the location hang in the silent room. While you were demanding money for non-existent heart attacks, you were feeding $250,000 into border town slot machines. Diane's jaw dropped. The theatrical tears vanished, replaced by a stark, pale shock. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The script she had written for this evening was burning to ash in front of her audience. I turned my attention across the table. And the third column belongs to you, Ash. Ashley looked at the paper, then back to me, her eyes wide. $120,000, I recited, ensuring every relative in the room heard the figure. Direct wire transfers matching the exact dates of your vehicle leases, your rent payments, and your tropical photo shoots. That magical family account you think Mom manages is just my paycheck. Ashley stared at the spreadsheet. The math was simple, but the implication was devastating. The realization hit her with physical force. The illusion of her independent, curated lifestyle shattered in real time. She was not a successful creative force. She was a dependent, relying entirely on the sister she had mocked just days prior. The blood fled her sunburned face, leaving her skin a sickly, mottled gray. She looked at Diane, searching for a denial, but Diane was paralyzed. Ashley was hyperventilating slightly. The phone she had been glued to slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. She did not bother to retrieve it. Her entire identity, her brand, her independence was printed on a sheet of hospital paper in front of her extended family. The humiliation she felt at the resort spa was nothing compared to the naked, searing exposure of this moment. The physical data sat on the table, immovable and pristine. A spreadsheet does not care about feelings. A spreadsheet does not respond to guilt trips or crying emojis. It simply exists, offering a sterile, undeniable reflection of reality. I watched the cognitive dissonance wash over Aunt Susan. She had spent the last 2 days praying for my soul, convinced I was a monster abandoning a sick father. Now she was staring at 12 rows of data that proved she had been played for a fool. No one likes realizing they're the pawn in a con artist's game. Her posture slumped, the self-righteous spine crumbling under the weight of the math. The silence in the dining room transformed from judgmental expectation to profound, suffocating horror. The matriarchal myth Diane had spent decades cultivating was dismantled in less than 60 seconds. Cornered predators do not surrender gracefully. As the shock wore off, the panic set in. Diane realized her performative emotion was useless against raw data. She slammed her hands onto the oak table, rattling the crystal wine glasses. "These are twisted lies," Diane shrieked, her voice cracked, soaring into a frantic, hysterical register. She abandoned the wounded mother persona, revealing the feral desperation underneath. "You forged this. You hacked my accounts and made this up to humiliate me in front of our family." "The data is public and verified," I replied, maintaining my calm, seated posture. "The county property records confirm this house has been paid off for 20 years. There is no mortgage. The entire foundation of your struggle is a fiction." Diane looked at the horrified faces of her sister and her nieces. She saw the judgment she usually weaponized against me reflecting back at her. The moral high ground was gone. She needed a new defensive position. If she could not win on integrity, she decided to win on territory. She puffed out her chest, drawing a sharp breath, reclaiming her physical domain. She pointed a trembling finger at the front door. "This is my house," Diane hissed, her eyes wild and darting. "I am the authority under this roof. I will not be interrogated by an ungrateful child in my own dining room." She believed the property gave her ultimate leverage. She assumed that owning the battlefield meant she dictated the rules of engagement. It was a desperate bluff built on a foundation of sand. She tried to assert dominance over the physical structure of the home, believing the walls and the roof validated her matriarchal status. However, she had entirely forgotten about the silent, towering figure standing in the shadows near the hallway archway. My grandfather gripped the polished wooden handle of his walking stick. He stepped out of the corner, bringing the frayed manila folder into the ambient light. Diane had attempted to claim ultimate authority through real estate, but she was about to learn that the ground she stood on did not belong to her. How would the patriarch respond to her final, desperate territorial claim? The frantic declaration hung in the dining room air. Diane stood at the head of the oak table, her fingers still pointing toward the front door. Her chest heaved. The pristine floral blouse seemed suddenly inappropriate for the raw, feral panic radiating from her posture. She had retreated to the final bastion of her manufactured authority. "This is my house," she had screamed. "I manage it how I see fit." The silence that followed was dense, almost physical. The cousins physically recoiled, stepping back toward the living room, distancing themselves from the epicenter of the blast. Aunt Susan, the lifelong enforcer of familial obedience, looked at Diane with an expression of profound disgust, recognizing the hypocrisy she had unwittingly defended. But the most significant movement did not come from the jury. It came from the shadows near the hallway. Grandpa Hector stepped into the warm glow of the chandelier. The rhythmic, heavy thud of his wooden cane striking the hardwood floor echoed like a gavel demanding order in a chaotic courtroom. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of an apex predator observing a panicked scavenger. He approached the oak table. Diane's finger lowered. Her wild, darting eyes locked onto her father. The matriarchal arrogance began to crack under the sheer weight of his presence. Hector was the only person in the family who never fell for her theatrical performances. He stopped beside my chair. He lifted the thick, frayed manila folder from under his arm. With a swift, powerful motion, he brought the cardboard package down onto the surface of the table. The impact was deafening. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room, vibrating the crystal wine glasses and startling Ashley so violently she physically jumped in her seat. The brittle, aged rubber band snapped under the sudden force, flying across the polished wood. Hector did not look at me. He did not look at the stunned relatives. He stared directly into Diane's terrified eyes. "This house is not yours, Diane," he stated. His voice was a low, booming rumble, stripping away the final layer of her defense. It was not a debate. It was a judicial ruling delivered by the patriarch. 6 months ago, Hector continued addressing the room, but keeping his gaze fixed on his daughter. "You walked into a regional bank in Boise. You sat across from a loan officer and attempted to originate a reverse mortgage on this property. You tried to leverage the equity of this home to generate a lump sum cash payout. You needed that capital because your credit cards were maxed out and Natalie's monthly deposits were no longer covering the escalating losses you were suffering in Nevada." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. A reverse mortgage is a catastrophic financial maneuver, typically a last resort that slowly drains the equity of a property until nothing remains for the heirs. It was the ultimate act of desperation from an addict searching for a final hit. Diane's face drained of all remaining color. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself on the edge of the table. How she whispered the word barely escaping her throat. "How did you know about the bank application?" "Because the deed was never solely in your name," Hector revealed the plot twist, dropping into the room with devastating precision. He reached into the opened manila folder. He bypassed the handwritten ledgers my grandmother had kept and pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal parchment. The documents were bound by a blue cover page bearing the embossed seal of a prominent estate planning law firm in Ada County. A bright red notary stamp was clearly visible on the signature page. "When we purchased this property for you and Richard 30 years ago, we structured the original title," Hector explained, his tone clinical and unyielding. "We maintained a silent overriding interest to ensure the asset remained within the bloodline. When the bank ran the title search for your reverse mortgage application, the underwriter flagged the discrepancy. They legally required our signatures to authorize the lien. The bank contacted my attorney. The puzzle pieces clicked together, forming a perfect, terrifying picture of Diane's impending ruin. She had attempted to sell the family castle to feed her addiction, entirely unaware that her parents still held the keys to the gate. That phone call confirmed everything my wife suspected before she passed Hector Rumbold. It proved you were not just stealing from your oldest daughter. It proved you were willing to liquidate the actual foundation of this family to fund your sickness. You were going to leave Richard homeless just to keep sitting at those slot machines. Richard, still standing near the archway, let out a ragged, broken sob. The cowardice that had defined his existence finally fractured, revealing the profound tragedy of a man who traded his dignity for a peace that never existed. He looked at his wife, recognizing the monster he had enabled. Hector dropped the heavy legal parchment onto the table, placing it directly next to my printed spreadsheet. "We legally intervened," the patriarch declared. "We executed the contingency protocols your grandmother designed. We removed your name from the deed entirely. We restructured the asset. This document is a formalized, irrevocable generational trust." He tapped the blue cover page with his calloused index finger. "This house belongs to the trust," Hector stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "And the sole beneficiaries of this trust are Natalie and baby Lily." The words hung in the air, shifting the molecular structure of the room. The kingdom Diane ruled, the physical territory she had used to assert her ultimate dominance, was legally handed over to the exact daughter she had abandoned in a trauma ward. The house she bragged about maintaining was now managed by the pack mule she had mocked. "You are a guest here," Diane Hector finalized. "You reside in this structure entirely at the discretion of the new trustee, and given your recent behavior, I highly doubt your tenancy will be extended." The wounded matriarch mask completely disintegrated. The theatrical tears, the manufactured anxiety, the aggressive territorial claims all burned away, leaving behind raw, unfiltered terror. Diane was staring into an absolute void. She had no money. She had no leverage. She had no audience left to manipulate. The family enforcers had turned against her. Her golden child was bankrupt. And the very roof over her head was currently controlled by the woman holding a spreadsheet detailing $500,000 of theft. Ashley, sitting across from me, finally broke. She did not cry for her mother. She did not cry for my injuries. She cried real, genuine tears of absolute poverty. The realization that her influencer lifestyle was permanently terminated crashed down on her. The cars, the vacations, the premium spa treatments were gone forever. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with the weight of her sudden irrelevance. Aunt Susan stepped forward from the sofa. She looked at Diane, then looked at the legal documents resting on the oak table. "I am leaving," Susan announced, her voice flat and disgusted. "Do not call me Diane. Do not ask me for favors. You are on your own." Susan turned and walked toward the front door, motioning for the cousins to follow. They filed out of the house in silence, the soft click of the deadbolt signaling the end of Diane's social reign. The dining room was quiet again. The audience was gone. The performance was officially canceled. I sat in the armchair, my hand resting gently on the gray hospital band looped around Lily's car seat. Mark stood beside me, his posture relaxed but eternally vigilant. I looked at the spreadsheet, then at the irrevocable trust documents. The financial autopsy and the legal execution were complete. The matriarch had been overthrown, the territory secured, and the truth permanently established. The snare had snapped shut on the trapper. I held the ultimate authority over the physical property and the financial ledgers. However, possessing power requires deciding how to wield it. Diane and Richard were broken, standing in the ruins of their own deception. Ashley was weeping in the corner. The investigation was concluded, but the story required a final resolution. How does a forensic auditor close out an account when the debtors are fundamentally bankrupt? The sharp click of the front door latch echoed through the silent dining room, sealing the departure of the extended relatives. Aunt Susan and the cousins were gone, taking the audience with them. The stage was empty, and the lead actress stood stranded in the ruins of her own theatrical production. I watched Diane closely, a part of my analytical mind curious if the sheer weight of the evidence would finally extract a moment of genuine accountability. It did not. True predators do not apologize when they are caught in a snare. They simply survey the terrain for a new target to absorb the blame. Diane whipped her head toward the hallway archway, her eyes locked onto my father. She pointed a manicured finger at his chest, her features contorted into a mask of pure resentment. "You let this happen," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You stood there and let them steal our home. You never protected me, Richard. You were always too weak to provide a real life for us." Richard did not defend himself. He did not raise his voice to counter the accusation. He just stared at the polished hardwood floor, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. He accepted the venom because submitting was easier than fighting. His defeat was total, cementing the tragedy of a man who sacrificed his own daughter to buy a domestic peace that never existed. He had enabled a monster, and now he was trapped in the cage with her, devoid of any shielding. Across the oak table, Ashley let out a loud, shuddering wail. The sound was sharp and guttural, piercing the heavy atmosphere of the room. She was not crying over the family fracture. She was not mourning the loss of a sisterly bond. She was weeping for her leased luxury vehicle, her tropical vacations, and her fabricated online persona. The Bank of Natalie was permanently shuttered, and the harsh reality of impending adulthood crashed into her curated bubble. She looked at her mother, demanding a solution, but Diane had nothing left to offer. The golden child was finally realizing that the pedestal she stood upon was built entirely out of my stolen labor. Without my paycheck, the pedestal crumbled into dust. I pushed myself up from the armchair. My fractured ribs voiced a dull, throbbing protest, but the physical discomfort felt incredibly distant. I was shedding a skin I had worn for 32 years. Mark stepped to my side, lifting Lily's infant carrier with a steady, protective grip. As the car seat swung upward, the ambient light from the overhead chandelier caught the frayed edges of the gray plastic hospital band looped around the sturdy handle. It was a cheap, smudged piece of medical identification, but in that dining room it looked like a Medal of Honor. It was the physical proof of my survival on the interstate. It represented the night I stopped being a compliant resource and started being a mother. I looked at Diane one final time. She was breathless, her chest heaving, waiting for me to issue a demand or offer a negotiation. She expected a drawn-out emotional argument over the property boundaries. I gave her nothing but cold, clinical finality. "The account is closed," I stated. My voice did not rise. It did not waver. I turned my back on the fallen matriarch and walked toward the entryway. I did not wait for a response. My husband and my grandfather flanked me, forming an impenetrable wall of genuine support. We stepped out onto the front porch, leaving the door wide open behind us. The crisp, freezing Idaho winter air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and fresh snow. It was the cleanest breath I had taken in a decade. The heavy, suffocating aroma of the Sunday pot roast faded, replaced by the clarifying chill of the high desert. Mark loaded our sleeping daughter into the back of the sedan. Hector tapped the roof of our vehicle with his hickory cane, offering a rare, genuine smile of approval before walking toward his own heavy-duty truck parked down the street. We drove away, navigating the icy suburban roads, leaving the abusers stranded inside a structure they no longer owned, drowning in a reality they could no longer manipulate. People always want to know how the legal dust settles in these situations. The mathematics of justice are rarely swift, but in this specific case, they were incredibly precise. Grandpa Hector did not hesitate. The Monday morning following the ambush, his retained attorney served Diane and Richard with a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Without my monthly deposits to artificially inflate their checking accounts, they lacked the capital to hire a defense lawyer or secure a new mortgage. They were forced to pack up 3 decades of accumulated possessions into cardboard boxes. The trust sold the property at market value, liquidating the asset to fund a high-yield educational account for Lily. Diane and Richard relocated to a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of Boise. The extravagant casino trips ceased entirely. A gambling addiction requires fresh capital, and Diane was officially bankrupt. But the true poetic justice landed exactly where it was needed most. With her parents destitute and her own credit ruined by a string of missed lease payments, Ashley had no choice but to enter the traditional workforce. The aspiring lifestyle curator was forced to accept a minimum wage position at a local retail boutique. She spends her days folding sweaters, ringing up customers, and dealing with demanding tourists. She is required to hand over a significant portion of her meager paycheck to help Diane cover the apartment rent and the grocery bills. The universe possesses a dark, symmetrical sense of humor. Ashley, the pampered beneficiary who mocked my corporate job and demanded I fix her vacation funds, became the new beast of burden. She inherited the heavy harness. She became the very mule she used to ridicule. I never spoke to them again. I maintain my Thursday evening phone calls with Grandpa Hector, checking in on the rancher who saved my sanity. I focus my energy on the true family I built with Mark, watching Lily grow and thrive in a house devoid of manufactured drama. My financial acumen is now reserved exclusively for my corporate clients and my own household ledger. I'm sharing this forensic audit with you because I know there are thousands of people sitting in the dark funding a fiction out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. If you are emptying your own reserves to keep someone else afloat, assuming your sacrifice will eventually earn their respect, stop and look at the math. Love is a mutual investment, not a predatory tax. A relationship that requires you to set yourself on fire just to keep another person warm is not a family bond. It is an extortion racket. I learned the hardest lesson of my life from a frozen highway, a hospital bed, and a battered manila folder. I share it so you do not have to endure a decade of theft to learn the same truth. The people who constantly praise you for being the strong one are not admiring your resilience. They are just naming the person they have decided they never have to carry. When the dust finally settles after a profound familial fracture, what remains is rarely just the cold mathematics of stolen money or the stark reality of legal documents. Long after the bank accounts are closed and the childhood home is sold, a deeper, more lingering silence takes hold. It is in this quiet aftermath that the true tragedy of the Gonzalez family reveals itself. The tragedy is not merely that a mother stole from her daughter, or that a father stood by and watched. The ultimate tragedy lies in the complete and utter failure of what it means to be a parent. In American culture, we place a heavy, almost sacred emphasis on the image of the traditional family structure. We revere the symbols of domestic success, the paid-off suburban home, the manicured lawn, the Sunday dinners filled with the scent of roasted beef. We are taught that these institutions are the bedrock of a stable society. But a structure is only as strong as its foundation. When that foundation is built on a lack of emotional awareness, devoid of honesty and fairness, the traditional family ceases to be a sanctuary. It becomes a beautifully decorated trap. Parenting is not simply the act of providing shelter or demanding respect. True family responsibility is an ongoing, lifelong commitment to seeing your children as independent human beings rather than extensions of your own ego or solutions to your own inadequacies. Diane and Richard Gonzalez failed the most fundamental test of parenthood long before the first dollar was ever wired to a casino. They failed the moment they stopped looking at their daughters as children who needed guidance and instead categorized them as tools to manage their own internal deficits. In many American households, there is a dangerous tendency to inadvertently punish the capable child. We praise the stoic, independent kids who do their homework, solve their own problems, and never ask for help. We call them mature. We call them strong. But without deep emotional awareness from the parents, that praise quickly morphs into exploitation. The capable child is gradually stripped of their right to be vulnerable. They are assigned the role of the load-bearing wall, expected to endure immense pressure without cracking, simply because they have proven they can survive it. Conversely, the child who is loud, demanding, and dramatic is often coddled. In a misguided attempt to keep the peace, parents like Diane swoop in to play the savior, shielding the fragile child from the natural consequences of their actions. They mistake enabling for love. They rob the golden child of the opportunity to develop true resilience. By shielding Ashley from every financial and emotional hardship, Diane did not prepare her for the real world. She crippled her. When the artificial safety net finally vanished, Ashley was left entirely unequipped to navigate adulthood, forced to learn the harsh realities of survival from the bottom of the retail ladder. Long-term guidance requires the courage to let your children face adversity fairly. It requires the emotional intelligence to recognize that fairness does not always mean treating every child exactly the same, but it absolutely means holding them to the same standard of character. You do not sacrifice the future of one child to subsidize the vanity of another. You do not weaponize obligation to cover up your own mistakes. Honesty is the only currency that actually matters in raising a family. If you cannot be honest with yourself about your own flaws, your own addictions, or your own cowardice, you will inevitably pass the bill for those shortcomings down to your children. Richard's silence was a masterclass in this specific type of generational debt. By refusing to speak the truth to his wife, he taught his daughters that peace is more valuable than integrity. He demonstrated that a father's role is not to protect his young, but to protect his own comfort. That is a legacy of cowardice that can take a lifetime to unlearn. Now, as Natalie holds her own daughter Lily, she faces the profound task of breaking a generational curse. She is no longer just a forensic auditor tracing lost capital. She is a mother defining the cultural values of a new household. Raising a child in the modern world requires vigilant emotional awareness. It means teaching Lily that her worth is not determined by her utility to others. It means showing her that love is given freely, not earned through silent suffering or financial sacrifice. It means building a traditional family structure where honesty is spoken at the dinner table, even when the truth is uncomfortable, and where boundaries are respected as a sign of health, not viewed as an act of treason. If there is a lesson to be carved from the ruins of the Gonzalez home, it is that blood simply dictates biology. Character dictates family. We are not obligated to set ourselves on fire to keep the people who gave us life warm. We are, however, obligated to ensure that the children we bring into this world never have to strike a match to earn our affection. There are countless people currently sitting at their own family dining tables, staring down at their plates, quietly carrying a burden that does not belong to them. They are the designated mules, the peacekeepers, the reliable ones, who are slowly being bled dry by the people who claim to love them most. If you recognize yourself in Natalie's journey, if you have ever realized that your supposed strength is just a convenient excuse for your family's exploitation, you are not alone. We invite you to join a community of cycle breakers. Subscribe to the Revenge Order channel. We share the stories of those who finally learned to read the ledger of their own lives and had the courage to close the account. Drop a comment and tell us the moment you realized your family's traditional values were actually just a beautifully disguised trap. As you go about your day, take a quiet moment to reflect on the architecture of your own life. Look closely at the people who rely on you. Look at the responsibilities you carry without question. Are you holding them out of genuine, reciprocal love? Or are you holding them because someone long ago convinced you that if you let go, the entire roof would collapse? And if the roof is truly that fragile, perhaps you have to ask yourself, is it really a home worth saving? Or are you just standing inside a burning building, convincing yourself the smoke is a sign of warmth?